So remember how I was primed to come back with a vengeance in my reading life in August, and then life happened instead? That's okay. We're going to talk about the 5 books I read in August and dig a little deeper. Some of these, most of these, we've already talked about in some capacity during a Feature Friday, so if you want a more extensive look at them, please feel free to check out those videos. But let's go ahead and dive into these 5 here, because it was still a really robust and fulfilling reading month for me. And if you're new, hi, hello, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel, and I would love to have you around more if you feel so inclined, so feel free to like and subscribe and hang out some more. But to jump into the month of reading, we started out with Enlightenment, or I started out with Enlightenment by Sarah Perry, which is Booker nominated. Now, I did not read this because it's Booker nominated. I have, some more interest in some titles because of the Booker nominations, making me more aware of them, but I already had my eye on this because I really enjoyed The Essex Serpent. I talked about that book in relation to the TV show years ago. I read The Essex Serpent when it came out, and I read Melmoth when it came out, which I notably did not like as much as I enjoyed The Essex Serpent. And The Essex Serpent I have talked about before in relation to it feeling a lot like Middlemarch in some ways. Stay with me here because it is vastly different in a lot of ways, but that kind of sprawling feel, and it feels to me, Essex Serpent feels to me very much like a sprawling 19th century novel in a lot of ways. And so I was kind of hoping that we would be kind of reclaiming some of the narrative stylings of The Essex Serpent for Enlightenment, because Melmoth felt a lot more episodic. With The Essex Serpent, in the way of the 19th century sprawling novels, you could kind of languish with the characters a little bit more, and the themes had room to kind of marinate, and it's just a slower kind of pace. Enlightenment is taking place in the modern age, or as close to the modern age as we can get within historical fiction, because I think the 90s are now historical fiction, even for adult fiction, which is something we just won't ponder. And this book is set in the 90s and moves into the current moment, or very close to the current moment, and it is following 2 characters in particular, Thomas and Grace, who live in this small town in, again, Essex. So we are returning to Essex and actually have a lot more in common with The Essex Serpent than I went in expecting, in terms especially of the kind of thematic echoes in relation to religion and science. But here the scientific element has to do with the heavens, which then of course ties in to the kind of religious elements as well. And we are following Thomas, who at the beginning of the book I want to say is in his 50s, and he is a newspaper reporter who's kind of having to shift to meet the current moment, and his editor recommends that he learn more about the stars and be able to kind of write about astronomy, astrology, astronomy for the paper. And so he takes this and he also kind of ties it in, and we see some of his newspaper entries early in the book, especially in a way that kind of plays with form, but the book doesn't really commit to that completely. We play with form in terms of time jumps, but we don't kind of interrogate what we can do with time narratively, which I thought would have been a really interesting avenue, but I could understand that becoming very convoluted very quickly. And so this also ties into, as I aptly turn to, the idea of the lowland ghost, and this ghost that may be haunting this nearby house, and how she was a studier of the stars as well, and how that kind of has been looming over Thomas and continues to loom over Thomas, and also just how that fits in with his life. And so Thomas is a closeted gay man in this small town in the 90s who goes to a very buttoned up church, and he has kind of been staying in this in-between realm between the city and home and his life within this church, particularly for at the beginning of the book, teenager Grace, who he met when she was newly born, and her mother died during childbirth, and her father was really lost amidst this. Her aunt comes in to help take care of her, but her aunt doesn't really warm up to her until Grace is older. And so Grace is just kind of this lost spirit in a lot of ways and a free spirit in a lot of other ways. And so the book, as it's described, is following the way two relationships kind of upset this long-standing friendship and how this friendship continues amidst all of this. And so the friendship is really the central glue of the narrative. However, I think that it's also much more complex than that in the way of these kinds of novels, and it's very much interrogating the kind of human spirit of things. And I do appreciate that we get a lot more from Thomas's point of view in this book, because Grace personally was kind of annoying to me. But it's again looking at this idea, as I described it in the Essex Serpent, of modernity and myth, and as I described it in my reading journal here as well, this tension between the divine and the worldly, which also comes into play in these characters' relationships. So we're following Thomas, and his relationship is much different, but again, him living closeted and what that means, especially within the context and the shadow of this church that he goes to. But then also Grace, who is very much a part of this world, and she starts a relationship with one of the boys in town. And then the rest of the narrative in the book kind of looms or lives in the shadow of this teenage relationship in a way where I kind of wanted to shake her sometimes later in the narrative and in the book, admittedly, but that's the reality of the situation. And so it's looking and kind of teasing out these ideas. And again, like with the Essex Serpent, enlightenment is a lot more theological in some ways without it being theological, if you know what I mean. It's not investigating or interrogating theology, but it's much more rooted in the spiritual than even I went in expecting, having read Perry's other work, or at least a portion of Perry's other work. And so there is a lot of exploration of the human condition. And even though it really is steeped in this kind of Christianity, it doesn't feel like it is preaching to me as a reader, and that is only my own reading experience, but I do think it's kind of exploring the human condition under religion in some ways, and the idea of the spirit and how we continue on. Now, it is a slower novel because of this, because it really is sitting in a lot of this feeling, and it's almost kind of nostalgic in some ways. Here I wrote down winding language that almost feels nostalgic in itself. It manages to encapsulate hope and sadness for unrealized dreams throughout, which is much better than I could have articulated in this moment. But there are a lot of really great lines that pepper this, such as, "Let me do some great thing before I die," or "I've caught time like a virus." And this idea of time, like I said, I kind of keep going back to, and it's so interesting to me, especially because we do have this historical figure, so time does come into play. We're exploring characters at very different stages of their lives, but the kind of crossroads stages in a lot of ways. And then in terms of the time, we do circle back in little kind of Easter eggy ways back to the Essex Serpent in ways that I wasn't even expecting. And so I don't think you have to have read the Essex Serpent to appreciate this or to kind of understand those moments. And even some of the moments that kind of reference Essex Serpent, I was like, did I forget something? Am I missing something? And I reread that book most recently again for the show. So I don't know. There's a lot to dig into here. Again, like I said when I reviewed this more in depth, I'm not sure that this will make it to the Booker shortlist. I guess we'll find out about that next week. I don't know what the other books on the list are looking like, so I can't really speak to that, but I was pleasantly surprised by this in the sense that it was a return to what I kind of wanted from Perry or was expecting from Perry post the Essex Serpent in a way that Melmoth wasn't exactly the reading experience I was hoping for. But at the same time, again, this is a slower, more reflective kind of languid novel, and so I don't know that it's going to be for every reader, which is fine. Not every book is for every reader, but it is a great kind of fall-winter book because of that, I would argue. My biggest caveat though, again, I didn't particularly like Grace, which I think is interesting. I think she draws really interesting people and characters here, so I would be interested to hear what you thought of some of these characters if you've read this book. And then next I listened to Not in Love by Ali Hazelwood, which is her newest adult contemporary romance, not to be confused with her paranormal romance that came out earlier this year, and this was a return to the kind of STEMinist kind of world, though a little separate. We were following food scientists here in a really interesting way for me as someone who grew up close to Purdue and around the kind of conversations around agriculture and ag science. Though, to be clear, I don't know anything about agriculture and ag science. Now, I will admit, I was a little nervous going into this one, which follows Rue and Eli, because the beginning of the book had this like caveat from Hazelwood that said that this was going to be a much different kind of tone than a lot of her other books, and it wasn't going to be as romantic comedy focused. This definitely had a lot more angst in it if we were going to tag it like a fan fiction. And so Rue and Eli as characters first meet as potential one-night stand hookups through an app, and that never actually happens because Rue's brother basically tracks her down and is harassing her at the bar, trying to get her to concede to selling a house because he needs the money, and Eli kind of steps in, takes charge, protects her, whatever, but it kind of puts a damper on the mood for the evening. And so then Rue goes to work the next day, and there is a group coming in to kind of assess, and they may be kind of taking over her job. And she is very close with the founder and kind of lead scientist of this company. And so she's sitting with all of her colleagues, kind of watching this introduction, and she recognizes Eli as one of these people. And so we have these kind of competing agendas, and I think it was really well done. One of the things I really enjoy about Hazelwood is the outside antagonist that usually is a factor, and I don't think the outside antagonist in this book is particularly surprising, but that's okay because I just like that dynamic. But going into this, it would be easy to say, oh, this may be harder to be on the side of the hero. But I think she makes really evident the stakes and objectives for both of these characters. Additionally, we get Eli's point of view in this, which I really appreciate. I do love a dual POV. And in the audiobook, I don't remember, and I know I've listened to a lot of Hazelwood, but I don't remember if we've had a male actor for the male love interest point of view in previous audiobooks, because that did jar me a little bit when I heard that voice, but I liked the setup there. And so we have these two characters that have this incredible attraction to each other. There is this chemistry, and then we have this kind of percolating heat from a hookup that never came to fruition that is kind of sitting and simmering. And there is also this tension between their competing and conflicting kind of objectives within this work culture. But amidst this, they still decide to hook up, and they basically have an affair with this end date kind of hanging over it. But things, of course, become much more complicated. Feelings become more complicated, though the trajectory of those feelings are somewhat different than in previous Hazelwoods. Now, I don't know how I would kind of frame this or rate this amidst Hazelwood's other work. I know that for some readers it has been much different and they didn't enjoy it as much, and some of that may be simply the way intimacy is handled in this, because we do have a lot of intimacy before feelings are really talked about, and I think that that is one of the things that Hazelwood was talking about and she talks about in the introduction, just to kind of warn readers. However, I do think a lot of those scenes are still developing character a lot of the time. I have enough distance from it now that I can't fully speak to that, but in terms of audiobooks from Hazelwood, I still had a good time. I don't know that I would rank it toward the top of the list for me, but it's also not at the bottom with the STEMinist novellas, so do with that as you will. Next, I read Truly Madly Deeply by Alexandra Bellafleur. I switched between audio and physical for this one, and this is the same author of the Fiancé farce that we talked about in a Feature Friday last year, and this has two main character love interests at the heart of this, so that is really fun. But our main character, Truly, who's the only point of view character in this book, is a romance author that at the beginning of the book catches her fiancé with another woman. And so she has this entire idea of love kind of come tumbling down, even as we as readers know, and I think she in her heart knew, that this was not a perfect love, that she was in it much more than he was. Clearly. And so instead of kind of clearing her schedule for the rest of the day and kind of working through the very intense and valid feelings that may spur from this, she goes immediately to tape a podcast in favor or talking about true love and love from the point of view of a historical romance author. But it's one of those podcasts where it's like contrasting points of view, where she meets and butts heads with Colin, who is a family lawyer, and notably the kind of divorce law perspective on this podcast. And he also happens to be the brother of the host of the podcast. And so they butt heads and clash at this recording, partially because Truly is so kind of fresh off the wounds of this breakup, and things don't go well. But the hits keep coming because when Truly is at her parents' house and is complaining to her mother about this guy and talking about her breakup, she finds out that her parents, which represent the epitome of true love to her, they are her fairy tale in a lot of ways, are deciding to take a break in their marriage. They are splitting, not divorcing, but taking some time apart. And she doesn't really know how to process this in a way that guides the rest of the book and makes it hard, is the stumbling block for me basically in the book, because she essentially becomes like a one-man Parent Trap kind of situation where she tricks her parents to go to the lake house for the weekend, thinking that she can help them reconcile. Now, in the meantime, she has been talking with Colin. He gets her number from his sister to apologize. They've been kind of bantering and flirting, and they end up running into each other at the lake house as well, and that further develops further. And that is really delicious. I do love the tension between these two. I love the intimacy in particular between these two. I think it's handled really deftly, but I think I would have liked to see them in some more contexts. We do get a little of this at the lake house, especially when we get to see Colin's family and get to see Truly come in to the dynamic of Colin's family and stand up for him and be on his team in a lot of ways, but we don't get to see them in a whole lot of outside circumstances. And so by the nature of the plot, we're kind of beholden to watching Truly kind of fumble through this attempt to reconcile her parents, which feels, admittedly to me, very juvenile, and it really instigated a lot of my secondhand embarrassment. Additionally, her parents both are theater people, and in case you didn't know, I am also a theater people. I have a background in literary management and dramaturgy, so I know theater. But this is the kind of theater that even with a theater degree, I think I would riot. Her dad is like a director and her mother is an actress, and they have every room in their house kind of named after a different notable theater person, and they have to kind of reference that person's work within that room in conversation. So it's used in the book, they're in the Sondheim room, and so they keep having to make references to Sondheim, which I think is just supposed to be fun and quirky, but I found it almost maddening. Like, I think that if I had to do that, I would throw things. And so it felt like a lot of the plot was trying to be quirky and funny and ended up feeling more juvenile to me, which was interesting because it contrasts so much against the intimacy, especially in this book. And that is what I heard talked up in this book a lot. I heard rave reviews about this book, and I do think that the relationship between these two was really interesting, and that's part of why I would have liked to see it in more contexts. I would have liked to see it developed more. We didn't really get to see them as a team outside of within his family unit too much, and hers as well, but outside of the context of these families, I wanted to see them a little bit more in the wider world. Like, what did their worlds look like? The podcast didn't really count to me. It still felt very contained. So I guess the world of this book felt very small, and it was beholden a lot to this quirk that I didn't really love, but I really liked the dynamic at the heart of this and the way that it explored this idea of love. And at its heart, I do think it was exploring this kind of idea of how we mythologize love, how love takes work. And that's part of what truly is not seeing or is afraid to see in relationship to her parents, which is then also kind of awkward to think about her in relation to her being a romance author, because her couples have to have conflict that they work through in order to achieve an earned happily ever after, right? Like, she's a best-selling romance author in this book. It has to happen. But then, you know, intellectually knowing something and living something are completely different. Either way, I still had a good time with this. I did like being able to slip back and forth between audio and physical. Yeah, that's kind of where I ended up sitting with it. And no, I'm not going to make any Sondheim references. And then I read Funny Story by Emily Henry, which we also did a full Feature Friday review on. And this is, as you surely know, her most recent adult contemporary romance. We, of course, have just received the title of her new book that's coming out next year. But this follows Daphne and Miles, who become roommates in the wake of the breakup of both of their relationships. Notably, both of their partners ran away with each other. So Daphne was engaged to Peter, and after his bachelor weekend, he comes home and basically says, I am calling off the wedding and running away with my childhood best friend Petra, who was on this bachelor weekend with us. And Daphne, who has moved to this completely new town in Michigan for him, for this relationship, for this life that they were supposed to be building together, is kind of thrown out on her own, and she ends up with Miles, who had been previously in a relationship with Petra. And so they had been sharing this space, but they didn't really know each other at the start of the book. And I did really, really like how this was structured in particular, because I was nervous going into this. I'm not gonna lie, because if you have two characters in presumably a romance, I mean, not presumably, it's a romance, and the whole conceit is that they're coming out of these long-term, really involved relationships, and this is kind of a traumatic break. I didn't know how that was going to go, but luckily we didn't start with the breakup. We started after the breakup. We started with Daphne already in this apartment, which I think worked so well. And of course, in typical Henry fashion, it is a romance and there is an HEA, and it is guided by that relationship, and that is at the center. However, it also sprawls out a little bit more and is really following Daphne kind of finding herself and allowing herself to form her own identity, because she'd always just kind of gone along with what Peter wanted, to the point where her fellow librarians, because she is the children's librarian in town, didn't really know her. And so not only is she getting to know Miles, and there is something burgeoning there, but she is getting to know her coworkers, forming friendships for the first time, kind of reconciling her relationship with her father, or what she thinks that was, and what and how she sees herself amidst the world, and whether she can belong to this town. And so I was really charmed in a way that I almost wasn't expecting. Happy Place last year was fine, but honestly, it didn't really blow me away, and I didn't know, or still don't know, I guess, how I feel about the characters in that, and whether they should have been together, and what their happily ever after looks like. Though how people live their lives, I guess, is none of my business, but they're fictional, so it is. But here it felt a little better, and both of these characters felt lived in, they felt real, and they both had weaknesses and insecurities, and how those played off of each other. For instance, Miles is a really likable, affable guy, and Daphne has a harder time kind of warming up to people, or getting people to warm up to her, getting close to people, trusting people. And so she is jealous of the way that she sees, the ease that she sees from Miles in terms of getting to know people. And she kind of almost writes him off in some ways, like, oh yes, of course this happened for you because you're so nice, or just kind of doesn't, or discredits some of his feelings or the work or what have you that went into something. And he is able to articulate that and call her on it. And so there's this wonderful push and pull, and how Daphne responds to when she messes up, I really loved how that was handled here. For instance, toward the end of the book, Ashley, one of her closest new friends, calls her a we person after Daphne kind of lets her down at a pivotal moment, and Daphne has to kind of sit with the idea that she has always prioritized who she is in a relationship and prioritized her romantic relationships to the detriment of friendships, and what that means and how that consideration and how that tension can exist in this romance, I think is really nice. And I like the reflection that that asks of Daphne as a character, but also the reflection that that makes possible for us as readers in that moment as well, especially as we see how Daphne maneuvers that and moves forward in a really spectacular way. And so honestly, I think there's just a lot of charm here, and there is a reason Henry is so popular. Okay, and then lastly, and most recently discussed, I read Masquerade by O.O. Sangiyomi, which we also talked about in a Feature Friday, and this is a medieval West African Hades and Persephone reimagining, retelling kind of, but it changes enough, which is notable and important because it does that thing that is taking ownership of the story in a way that I think is really successful. Now, in spite of that, I was ultimately a little mixed on this. It might just be because this was one of my most anticipated of July. I've had this on my radar for a long time. I really had it built up in my head, and I loved the setting of this in particular and getting to explore that. But the premise of this is that our protagonist, Adodo, is a blacksmith, though she was born into this, because in this world, this is a lower class. These are the women that are kind of unwanted by society for whatever reason. And she catches the eye of a traveler one day while making daisies and gives him this flower. And then when she's going to run errands for her mother, is kidnapped. And she wakes up in the world of the Elephant of Yoruba land, which is the warrior king, the warrior ruler, who is this man that she met when she was a blacksmith. And he wants to make her his wife and views it as a love match. And he, while the king, reigns under this crown or mask that hides his face, and so the elephant kind of exists seamlessly throughout time. So while he, as Aremo, is the ruler, he also exists as this ruler who kind of moves throughout. And so in a way, this represents the kind of god of the underworld, the kind of master of death angle, right? And so we have these images of death and rebirth, especially in relation to Adodo and how her old life dies and is reborn, you know, kind of going back to the myth, of course. But she is pulled into the political intrigue of this world, which is so interesting. This world is lush and there are a lot of political machinations. And I wanted to get to sit in a lot of that more in order for it to feel more nuanced, especially because we are watching Adodo kind of stepping into her power and learning her power within this world. But she starts out so naive at the beginning of the book that I feel like she learns things a little too fast in a way where we don't get to see it, and a lot of things happen off page. For instance, she is being trained in battle by Aremo, and we see like one training session and it's referenced, but it doesn't give the sense that a lot of time has passed with this. We don't really get the sense that she has progressed in any way, and then all of a sudden she is going off into battle with him. And so there is kind of nuance to that. She's going for different reasons. It's not like he is clearing her for battle, but there is this idea that she's holding her own in that moment, and that is kind of a turning moment in a way where I don't know if we had gotten to that turning moment, if that makes sense. At the same time, all of the pieces are there. So I think that if we had gotten to live in the world a little bit more, and especially if those political moments had a little bit more room to breathe, because there is a lot of politicking in this book, but some of those threads don't fully tie together in a satisfying way. For instance, Adodo's kind of antagonism with one of Aremo's main generals, or his antagonism against her from the moment she steps foot in this world, and just how a lot of those things are resolved. So again, I talk about this more in depth in the Feature Friday, but while I would have liked to see it push a little bit more, again, the language does cover up a lot of this for me. I still really enjoyed my time, and I enjoyed the world of it, and I really appreciate that it takes the original kind of germ of the idea of Hades and Persephone and makes it its own within the context of that world. And so I still very much enjoyed it. it. And I'm also eager to see what else we get from this author because it is a debut. And so that is what I read in August. So let me know what you read in August. If you've read any of these books, I would love to hear your thoughts as well. As always, thank you for hanging out and listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.